Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the second training in our six-part Building Inclusive and Equitable Workplaces training series. My name is Trevor Matthew, FinTech Data Developer at Choice Bank and also the chair of the Chamber's Professionals of Color program. The newest program at the Chamber, Professionals of Color offers development and networking opportunities to the range of diverse professionals from across our region. Operating under a mission to impact Fargo-Moorhead, West Fargo community by creating inclusive opportunities for professionals of color to develop personally and professionally through meaningful engagement and a sense of belonging. Our program is built on four pillars: networking, professional development, education, and service. To learn more about POC or to get involved, please go to our website at fmwfchamber.com/POC or visit our social media pages on Facebook or Twitter by using the name at FMWFPOC. Again, thank you for joining us this morning for the second training, Inclusive Leadership, Beyond Leadership Buy-in to Leadership in Action. If you were unable to make our first training, no problem at all. After today's session, you can view that recording on the same webpage you are viewing this live stream on. Before I turn it over to Kira, just a couple of notes. As you're listening along, please feel free to utilize the questions and answer tab or the discussion feature on the right side of the live stream. If you would like to ask your question anonymously, please feel free to enter anonymous into the required name box. We have time reserved at the end for questions. Following today's event, the Chamber team will distribute a post-event survey as well as SHRM and HRCI codes if you are seeking continuing education credits. The event recording will also be published to this webpage once it's prepared if you wish to share today's webinar with a colleague or watch it again. Additionally, registration is open for the upcoming series topics, and we're happy to share the event recordings with anyone so they can get caught up. Finally, your registration for today's event is good for the remaining 4 sessions. The Chamber team will send out event reminders with the link, which will remain the same as each upcoming session approaches. Now, please help me welcome our presenter, Kira Kimball. Kira, I turn it over to you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second webinar in our series. I bring you greetings from Sioux Falls, South Dakota in my home, and I'm looking outside my kitchen table at a very beautiful day. So I hope wherever you are also seeing the same outside your window. Before we get into the presentation, I'm so interested in knowing, is this your second time? Did you attend a couple weeks ago presentation, or maybe you're joining us for the first time? So I would invite you to drop into chat first or second, just to get an idea of who we have here with us today. But again, welcome, so glad to have you. A couple weeks ago, we spent time talking about the business case, and I gave you lots of statistics, lots of percentages and numbers about changes in demographics, changes in buying power, return on investment for committing to diversity, equity, and inclusion work, which is incredibly exciting and an important foundation for you to consider as you start or continue this work in your business. Today, we're switching to you, to me, and really thinking about our leadership as inclusive leaders and what that might look like and how to become a more inclusive leader. So it looks like we've got some idea about the chat and how many times folks have attended. Most people are attending for the second time around. So glad to have you. First time attendees, we're also glad to see you here today. Now, some of you are familiar or have seen some of this series before. One of the roles that I have in Marshall McLennan Agency in our Sioux Falls office is to be community facing. And I have stood up along with some wonderful community partners and businesses, a coalition. So we have shared some of these webinars as well. So if you're joining for the first time or the second time, we're glad to have you. Here are the learning objectives I really hope that you'll take away from today's session. I'm going to introduce you to a model framework for inclusive leadership development, something that is really approachable and practical for you to take to go with you. Secondly, I'll be defining what are the key inclusive leadership traits. What do they look like and how do they show up in behavior and action? Third, you'll have the opportunity to reflect on what does inclusive leadership currently look like in your organization. And then finally, I know so many of you are inspired to take your leadership outside of your business and really to impact the Fargo-Moorhead, West Fargo community. So that is incredibly exciting. So another quick question to drop in the chat. I'm really interested in knowing what industries we have represented here today on our webinar. So if you could type in the chat, if you're manufacturing, if you're agribusiness, financial services, nonprofit, education, would love to hear from you. This is also a great way for you to see who else in your industry might be passionate about this subject so you can find ways to collaborate together. So would you take a moment just to drop your industry in chat? As a review, last time we talked, I defined what diversity is in terms of how I teach as a DE&I educator. And oftentimes, diversity, people go directly to the salient features that we have on our physical body. And if you look here at this honeycomb, you can really see that diversity is incredibly rich. There are many components of diversity. And in the presentation a couple weeks ago, I did really focus on race, ethnicity, and gender, and some age, because that's where the data is on this research. But today and going forward, the conversation about diversity is really going to encapsulate this whole honeycomb. So I really want you to think big picture about yourself. Now, today, you may be showing up as a leader. You may be showing up as an individual inspired to do something in your organization and in your community, but I would suggest that all of us have the opportunity to lead, no matter what our role or position is in the company. So why is inclusive leadership what we need right now in our business community? The reality is that good leadership is not enough to advance inclusion. And so many of us want to be nice and we want to be liked, but nice is just not going to get us there. Because what you're going to learn today is inclusive leadership really doesn't play it safe. Inclusive leaders, when they move towards their journey, they're going to disrupt systems within their businesses. They're going to look at the status quo and find what the barriers are for inclusion and equity, and they're going to change their practices and their policies. So really, as an inclusive leader, we go beyond those traditional roles. And our goal is really for engagement in a very deep way, in a way where we can fully show up in the workplace as our authentic selves. This quote here, this bit of research, employees who do not feel adequately recognized are 2 times more likely as those who do to quit in the next year. So seeing your employees, not just for the roles and what they do in your organization, but seeing them as a person is really important. Let me check in with the chat to see what types of industries. We have, it looks like a lot, and they came in pretty quickly. We've got ag, STEM with IT, marketing, healthcare, nonprofits, higher education, business. So we're glad to see you here. So continuing, why is inclusive leadership what we need now? Almost 70% of us, when we cross that threshold, are not engaged. 50 to 70% of workers, when they quit a job, they quit their manager, they quit their leader, not their company, not the role that they play. And some of this reason is because they don't feel valued for who they are as an individual. And when we look at engagement statistics, 83% of executives rank having engaged and motivated people as the top factor that is going to contribute to your success as a company. So engagement is something that is important and drives. But the reality is employees who identify as authentic at work, meaning they can show up fully as themselves And this is a great outcome when you have an inclusive leadership model in your business. They find that 16% of them are more engaged than those who don't identify as authentic. So that's an important consideration and a great business outcome. We know that high engagement leads to productivity and retention. And the reality is a culture of inclusivity creates a pathway to engagement for all people. And that's really important. So when you think about the role that you play in your business, I'm curious if you'll drop in chat what that role is. Are you the HR leader? Are you an inspired employee? Are you a supervisor? Are you an executive level? We'd love to know the different roles that are showing up for today's presentation, because this really is all about leadership. Before we get started, I really want to introduce you to an important concept in the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion called covering. And this has everything to do with creating an inclusive environment and becoming inclusive leaders. Many of us do not feel completely safe at work sharing all of who we are. So we downplay or we hide parts of our identity to fit in. We do this maybe because we know it's going to make our situation easier at the workplace. So I want you to really think about that. I want you to think about it as a person, as a worker, as someone who manages people, builds teams, has colleagues. I'll share a little bit about my own journey. And if you remember from our first session, I talked about transparency and authenticity and vulnerability. So that's how I'm going to show up to you today. So my own journey in my career development, there were about 2 years where I had to leave the world of work because of debilitating depression and anxiety. This was after getting 2 graduate degrees from Purdue University, ready to take on the world, and then my world came crashing down. I had a blip on my resume for 2 years. And when I went back into the world of work, when I was interviewing, when I was talking with people about my past, and when I ultimately got a position, I really covered that part of me. And when you think about silencing yourself or cutting out part of your life, for me, it was 2 years. That's a big deal. And when you think about other diversity on the spectrum, not feeling safe to share who you are, that takes a lot of energy to quiet that part or to hide it. And that energy could better be used in the workplace, helping with productivity, helping with product creation, solution generating, serving your customer base, your client base, whatever that might be. So when we create environments that don't have psychological safety, that don't invite the whole person, it limits us as an employer. So let me check in on the chat to get an idea about who we have here. We have lots of HR colleagues. We're glad to have you. We have some CEOs, account executives, senior managers, consultant, executive assistants. It's wonderful to see different roles because we're all in this together and we're all part of the solution. So when we go back to covering, 61% of us feel we need to cover something about who we are, that we're not showing up wholly, and we're taking energy to hide that part of us. Our members in the LGBTQ plus community, 50% don't come out of the closet and tell their story. That's a really big consideration. So today, what I hope to do is give you some tools that will help you to become an inclusive leader and create that environment. So I want to give you some real world examples of covering self-talk, just so you can heighten the reality of what some of your coworkers, maybe yourself, say when you enter the workplace. Coworkers keep inviting me to bring my boyfriend to work events, but I'm really afraid to because he's Black. I haven't brought photos of my partner and me to work because then they'll know I'm gay. I'm so nervous my coworkers are going to ask me why I'm fasting. What will they think of me as a Muslim? I'm so glad that I'm white passing. I'm not sure how my team would feel about me coming from a family who came from Mexico. The team asked me to go out with them every Thursday. I just keep saying I'm busy. I can't tell them I'm going to AA. I'm going to wait as long as I can to tell my boss that I'm pregnant. I really want that promotion. My colleagues keep telling me I'm such a hero because I'm a vet. I really just want to tell them I'm overcome by PTSD. And I could go on screen after screen of different statements of self-talk that our employees and colleagues say to themselves that bring concern because they're so afraid if they share these identities that make up them as a human being, that they're going to be stereotyped, that they're going to be looked over for promotions, for mentoring opportunities, for the big project, for the big client or opportunity, or that they won't be able to reflect your brand in the marketplace. And these are real fears. And this is why inclusive leadership is incredibly important. So this is the book that I'm reading from today or teaching from today. A model framework is going to be described to you. Jennifer Brown writes a very approachable book that's easy to understand, and that's why I like it, and that's why I've been teaching off of it. So that's where our focus is going to be. But what I want to lead with before we dive into looking at the continuum is that this is a journey. This is a continuous journey. There's not a destination that we can get to as an individual. And I purposefully chose this image of what a journey might look like as opposed to a smooth pavement highway that you can roll through really easily. Because the reality is sometimes we have to take small steps and it might seem a little unsafe and a little uneven and a little murky out there because this is hard work. There's self-discovery that happens here. And once we have that self-discovery, throughout this process, we're inspired by the knowledge we've learned to do the work and start looking at policies, procedures, and practices that get in the way of becoming a more inclusive and equitable organization. So I want you to keep in mind the journey. An overview of the continuum we're going to talk about this morning. There are 4 phases, and I'm going to give you deep dive descriptions into each one of them so you can get an idea where you might be or the thinking and behaviors you might have during this continuum progression. So in phase 1 and phase 2, unaware and aware, this is really internal. This is us looking at ourselves, reflecting on our own journeys, seeing who might have invested in us, what maybe helped us along the way, seeing that maybe we're not treating everyone in an equitable way, or maybe we invest in the same people. 3rd and 4th, active and advocate. This is when you take the learning and then you take it outside into your business. You start having conversations with your colleagues, with the decision makers. You start looking at your community and working on change. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we can progress through these different stages. I'm going to do my best to use myself as an example as I try to model the behavior and share what has worked for me, where my opportunities are for continued growth. So let's start first with the beginning of the continuum, being unaware. So in this stage, you really lack the knowledge about issues around inclusion. You don't have a lot of insight to that. You don't see how inequalities are really perpetuated in organizations. It's just not part of your awareness. It's not that you see them and disregard them. You simply aren't aware of that. You may have grown up as part of the majority demographic in your community, not being exposed to difference as an example. And I think of myself growing up in Huron, South Dakota, a couple hours west of Sioux Falls. And in my community in the 70s, the major majority of individuals looked exactly like me. The children looked like me, the parents looked like me. I didn't have a great deal of awareness about difference. And I didn't really have the opportunity to look at the world through a different lens. And because I wasn't exposed to difference, because individuals' experiences were very similar to me, I didn't really recognize what exclusion looked like. When I think about my own experience of feeling excluded, which is very minimal compared to many diverse communities, I remember being called carrot top or freckle face, and those things didn't feel good to me. So that was only my experience of exclusion, but it didn't tell a really big story of diversity. And this is what happens in unawareness. And as a leader, someone at the beginning of this continuum, and that doesn't have anything to do with age. We can all be at the beginning of this continuum, no matter our age. But we really don't see that some of these inequities and inequalities, that they're hardwired into our organizations, that they're completely baked in, and they've historically been there. And in that unawareness, we just operate as we always have. And we don't recognize that making those changes take a lot of energy. In this stage, we also see that diversity is more of compliance. We often see this is an EEOC thing, or I need to check the boxes to do the right thing in terms of being compliant and following the rules. In this stage, we really don't have the awareness that diversity can bring great benefits to our organization from a cultural standpoint, as well as from a productivity and differentiating standpoint. So before I move on to the next state of aware, I'd like to have you in chat, if you would, share if you have a formal learning and development program. Do you do training and investing in your team in a formal way? Would love to hear that, because someone who would move forward with inclusive leadership development, this would be an important attribute of an organization to be successful. So let's talk about aware, moving along that continuum. In this stage, you really are beginning to learn how much you don't know about others' experiences. You see the world that maybe my worldview is not the only reality, and there's different ways of seeing the world. And again, I think about my own experience leaving Huron, going to college. I went to college at Minnesota State University Moorhead in the late 80s, early 90s. I loved it. I love the FM West Fargo area. But when I went to college, I didn't see a lot of diversity again from a racial perspective or an ethnic perspective or a worldview perspective. There were a lot of individuals that were still like me. So I went on my way of identity development and values clarification and career development, but I really didn't have that perspective of there's different ways of living, of believing, of making decisions, of justice, whatever those worldview differences might be. And really, in that instance, I make decisions based solely on my perspective. And as a leader in this situation, it's important for us to consider what that looks like. When we're making decisions and we're only doing it from our perspective, whether it's our leadership style, our cognition style, our worldview, our experience and background, that we have some blinders on, and that there might be opportunities for us to grow and become more aware and value the difference in opinions. And really, that for me was when I went on to graduate school in Indiana. And we had over 80 countries represented and different regions of the United States coming together. And that was a huge awareness opportunity for me. And someone who is leading and learning about this, when you start developing that awareness that, wow, my perspective is not necessarily right with a capital R or true with a capital T. There may be other values that could be important and voices for me to hear from. And when we start thinking about that, we get this awareness that there might be some disadvantages that some of our colleagues, my colleagues, might have. And that what has maybe made my career journey easier than perhaps other individuals. Maybe I was mentored, maybe I was given promotions or opportunities. How does that really happen? So someone who's aware is really starting to lean into that, and they're recognizing there's something here that maybe my privilege or my ease or my advantage is different than someone else's. And how can I, as a leader moving through this continuum, support that diversity and help uplift them? You start considering who's mentored you, who have you supported? That's a really critical thing here. Who haven't you felt supported by? And you really start looking out and recognizing I might be mentoring the same kind of people I've always mentored. I think of myself, white, young women have historically been those people I have invested in. But as I develop my inclusive leadership, I really start getting active and I move into the space and I realize there are other people that I need to invest in order to create equity and inclusion in my organization and also create an opportunity to make it a better place and differentiate in the market. So in active, you're starting to move out of the self-awareness and self-discovery. You're recognizing there are differences and systems do get in the way of some people's success. Maybe my practices and how I lend my privilege or open doors for people are getting in the way of other people's success who might need some of that support. So you start using your awareness and you begin to act. You put yourself in the place of discomfort, that whole statement about getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. And then you start assuming responsibility. You say, I've learned a lot. I've learned enough to know that my business, my organization, my style is not bringing in everyone. It's not creating a seat at the table where someone can show up, but they also can contribute. So at this point, you're inspired. You feel ready to start taking more responsibility as a colleague and as a leader. And in this, you start shedding unproductive behaviors and unproductive thoughts. This might be a time when you start recognizing your unconscious biases and they become more conscious. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks because that is critical for the active leader to really see what stories am I telling about this person who doesn't look like me, who's applying for this job, or is looking for a promotion, or is acting for a raise. What am I telling? So you start shedding these things about you that might get in the way of inclusion and advancing equity in your workplace. You begin to communicate new ideas and you start sharing this with your colleagues, with your work groups, with your strategic planning colleagues, and you start speaking out loud that, this is really important. When we make decisions, when I make decisions, I see myself going to people who think like me, who talk like me, who are going to confirm, which is called a confirmation bias. I'm not going to someone who thinks differently, who's had different experiences, maybe has come from a different part of the world to poke holes into my strategic vision or to my product plan or to my project. So you really start having these productive conversations, which are going to get a little uncomfortable because you're going to start feeling like you're a disruptor, and there may be people within your organization that are feeling that way too. So it's important to bring them in because in this stage, and I know this for myself, after I had 100 conversations in Sioux Falls in 2019 about diversity, equity, and inclusion in business, it did get uncomfortable because I was inviting people to start thinking differently about who they recruit, how they engage and promote. And even some of my own colleagues throughout MMA were wondering about this, and they won't always disagree. They won't always agree. There might be a great deal of disagreement, in fact. And it's really important, and I say this for myself, to hear me say this, we've got to stay the course. You have over 300 community business members showing up today. There's passion around this in Fargo-Moorhead, West Fargo. And that's why we're creating this community, and the chamber has come alongside so boldly to say, we want to provide this education so we can empower you to do this work together. But when you talk with people in your business who don't know about inclusive leadership, haven't gained that self-awareness that you have, you're going to have to bring them along because they're not at the same part of the journey that you are. So being able to read the readiness of your team, of your decision maker, of your organization as a whole is going to be critical, and to help invite them into the self-discovery process. So the active leader really is getting ready to start making some changes. So I'm going to check in. And it's wonderful to know after that last chat poll that the majority have indicated you have personal and professional development already built in your organization. So the framework is there. So from my perspective, this is a super opportunity and a wonderful enhancement to those learning and development programs that you have. The fourth stage is the advocacy. And this is really when a leader is stepping fully into saying, my organization has to change. We have to pivot. We're not doing good enough to create that psychological safety where everyone can show up wholly as who they are, all of their identities, and being able to be comfortable owning their space. So in this area, as an advocate, you start to commit to disrupting those harmful practices. You sit down and you look at your recruitment protocols, and you might set some goals about how to change those protocols. You might do some training around unconscious bias in the resume review process or in the selection committee. You may work hard to get diverse voices as part of that selection committee. So you're really starting to think about disrupting the inequities and trying to find a way to create more of a level playing field. In this instance, the advocate is not going to be okay with jokes that undermine different communities or comments, microaggressions, which I'll talk about in a couple weeks, that really are slight undermining of individuals. You're going to start challenging those. And you're going to learn some tactics in this space where you're going to invite someone maybe to lunch or to coffee or to your office, and not just interrupt the conversation right there and then, but give them an opportunity to hear some education from you and why you believe as a business leader, again, no matter where you are in your organization, that this is not how we show up as our organization. And that language can really be weaponized and hurt individuals and decrease their engagement. And if we reflect back on the opening slides, creating this culture of inclusivity as an inclusive leader is going to up your ante on employee engagement and all people feeling like, I don't have to take the energy to cover my veteran status or that I'm a Muslim or that I'm a lesbian. My employer not only creates safety for this, but celebrates the difference that each of us brings. That's going to be great outcomes when we think of productivity and engagement. In this area, you are interested in knowing and keenly attentive in observing if colleagues are feeling valued. You're going to show up as someone who's interested in asking, maybe bringing together small focus groups of diverse communities, however they show up in your organization. You will maybe set some policy and practice around, if we have a strategic planning meeting, we must have diverse voices represented. Again, how you might define that. But you're really going to start changing your practices. You're going to put it in writing. So if you retire in 2 years from your position, as an example, that your company that you're leaving is going to continue on with those same values because you've written it into maybe your mission and vision, but you've written it into your policies and practices that impact people. And as an advocate, you're going to commit time, you're going to commit energy, resources, people to make sure that inclusion and equity stay at the top of your list. When I work with businesses and they seek my consultation, oftentimes they think about, we want to create a program over here for DE&I. And I really invite them to think more holistically, because the greatest benefits and the best engagement opportunity is when an organization decides to weave in DE&I practices into all parts of who you are. How you show up on your website, how you hire people, how you promote, diversifying your supplier vendors, your business partners that you might work with, how you show up in your community and who you're sponsoring. So really having a holistic strategic plan to include this into every part of your business. That's where the stickiness really comes. And in the advocacy stage, you're not going to be afraid to go to places where you might feel uncomfortable. You might show up at the Festival of Nations as an example, where there's lots of different cultures there. For me, when I was moving through this advocacy stage, and I'm still an emerging advocate, I went to an all African American church, and I wanted to have the experience of what it's like for my friends and colleagues in the Black community to come to business meetings or to go to our grocery store or to go to the theater where they might be one of the very few. I wanted to have that experience to show up as one of two out of 40 individuals at that worship service. So I would encourage you, if you feel inspired to put yourself in those situations where you might be the underrepresented individual, or you might be the one who's feeling alone or different, because that's going to heighten your awareness, and that's going to heighten your empathy, your compassion, your understanding. And not only those, and those are critical parts, but it's also going to inspire to do better in our businesses. And in this situation, you will start reflecting about who do you mentor. And I think about this for myself, which I shared. And part of my journey has been looking differently about who I can invest in, because I realize that my privilege can help other people who maybe haven't had the advantage that I have, or can't navigate society, the business community, with the ease that I can. So I want to extend that to diverse talent. I am mentoring for my first time a young Black male professional. That's new to me and my experience, but this is me working on my advocacy as an inclusive leader to invest in that talent. Let's talk a little bit, and let's kind of distill and summarize the pathway to inclusive leadership. And it's important for you to know that this continuum might be different for different communities. You know, for example, I might feel very comfortable in my advocacy stage for the LGBTQ plus community. That may be where I'm at in that development, but I might be more aware in terms of supporting the Muslim community or refugee and immigrants as an example. So we might be at different spaces on the continuum depending on the communities that we are wanting to learn about, interrupt our practices for, and ultimately serve. So think about that too. So when we summarize and really distill some of these inclusive leadership traits, these 6 C's are a great way to remember it. As an inclusive leader, when you show up, you are committed. You're going to do the hard work. And it's not something that's going to be a back burner. And I think about, you know, for me, when George Floyd was murdered back this spring, I knew that if I'm going to show up as the inclusive leader I want to be, I need to reach out to my Black friends and my Black colleagues and speak out loud about the tragedy. And it's not usual for us to reach out to an individual because of their diversity. It was a new behavior for me, but I knew that my experience of that tragedy and other tragedies that have happened are critically different than my Black friends and colleagues. And I remember that weekend texting and calling. I was nervous. And maybe you get nervous too. I wanted to say the right thing. I wanted to show up in the right way, and I didn't want to misstep. We're going to make mistakes as an inclusive leader, and that's an okay thing. Leading with humility is a great way to help with that mistake. But I can't tell you, and maybe some of you did the same thing, how my colleagues came back to me and said, "Thank you for this acknowledgement. Thank you for this support, Kira." So we're committed and we're courageous. We do the hard thing. It takes energy to talk with someone who continues to make jokes about women, about the LGBTQ plus community, about natives, whatever that might be. It's the easier thing to walk away, go back to the office, let that go, but that undermines your inclusive culture. It also undermines me as a leader when I say I'm going to show up this way. I've got to be courageous. And that's why in this space, friends, it's really important to find colleagues who can come alongside you and you can come alongside them to do this work together. so you can support and have conversations when it does get challenging and when those naysayer voices are in your head, because it will take continued courage. Cognizance is really about self-awareness, listening to your self-talk when you're meeting with diverse individuals, when you have the opportunity to meet a vendor who maybe doesn't show up like you do or identify as you do, a potential business partner, a client that you might serve, who you pick up the phone with, who opens the door and sits down before you. We've got to have that self-awareness about what our biases are. We all have bias. Unconscious bias is about as human can be. But what do we do with that? When we know that, all right, I'm telling a story about this person before I even hear from them, if you can interrupt that, that is a great starting point. I do that for myself all the time. So cognizance, being aware of your practices and your thoughts. Being curious, leaning into an individual. And there's two sides of the curious coin. There's one that's suspicious, where you might raise your, for me, my left eyebrow, not so good. And you're leaning in because you're like, I don't know about this. The flip side of curious is that you're genuinely interested in learning about someone else. You want to get to know their worldview, their practices, their background, who they are as an individual. And that really leads to psychological safety. When someone says, I'm so glad that you've joined the team. I would love to grab a coffee with you or give you an opportunity to share about yourself, and then do the same thing back. So building relationships separate from our job codes, but from who we are as people, and really being genuinely interested in knowing. Having some cultural intelligence. When we are working with different communities, and I think again about immigrants and refugees who come from a different country, which they may have a very trauma-informed or a trauma-based background, it's really important for us, if we're working with immigrants and refugee communities, to be trauma-informed in our workplaces. It's critical. But also some of the individuals of diversity who come into our workplaces may have different customs, they may have different practices. Holidays, for example, I brought up the Muslim example of covering during fasting, which would be Ramadan, which covers a lot of May. Knowing this as an employer, that you may have team members who celebrate differently is critical. We have one business in town here in Sioux Falls that actually has a meditation room. So all people of all faiths or no faiths can take a time out and use that room for themselves. So that's having some cultural insight. And you may also consider this for your benefits, for the way you celebrate, for the holidays that you lift up. An example could be Juneteenth. Several businesses throughout the country have said, we are going to celebrate the Black community emancipation on Juneteenth, on June 19th in our businesses by celebrating this as an official holiday. And maybe this is something that you could consider or would consider. Collaboration, I've talked about that a lot. Making sure you bring people to the table, invite opinions, get their feedback, hear their voice, ask for their experience of what it's like to be in your workplace. Take that and continue. If you're doing great in these areas, do better if there's an opportunity to change, or consider stopping that practice. So collaboration is really critical. So in summary, an inclusive leader, you're going to model that vulnerability and authenticity. You're going to show up as yourself beyond that job role, because that's going to help other people feel that they can safely be themselves as well. You'll hold each other accountable. You'll hold yourself accountable. You might find a partner. In fact, I have an accountability partner who asks me, okay, Kira, look up. Are you being who you said you're going to be as an inclusive leader? So I would encourage you to consider that type of partnership with a confidant. In an organization, you want to define what is acceptable and what is unacceptable behavior. That helps you become the organization you want to be, or detracts and creates those barriers. We want to be aware of our privilege. And privilege doesn't mean that you haven't had difficulties. It just is an advantage that you might have that you didn't do anything to get. And you may not have even asked for it. So it's really important for us to be aware of that and to use our privilege to challenge norms and practices that might exclude. I've talked about taking a strong stance against bias, against resistance, and really having conversations head on, bringing in dialogue, purposefully engaging individuals, and really defining how DE&I can be woven in all parts of your business. So keep these in mind as you think about yourself. So here are the benefits. If you decide, and maybe you have already decided, and maybe you're enjoying these benefits, which is fabulous, you will see a thriving and engaging team by creating an inclusive environment through your leadership and psychological safety. Collaborative and respectful relationships. When I'm not afraid that I can show up and I can work with this team and I know that I'm valued and my team member values, you're not going to have all those difficult team kind of conversations because you're in it together, which certainly will create generative and innovative types of environments for you to create different product lines, different services, however you show up in the marketplace. And certainly the increased engagement, as we talked about in the beginning, is going to help with that productivity and opportunities for increased revenue. Your brand will be differentiated as you're competing for workforce. Fiercely, I know that. An employer who shows up committed to this is going to be attractive to those seeking. And then finally, who doesn't want this? When I think of employees on our team in our Sioux Falls and Fargo offices, we want to empower people to be who they are because they're going to bring that discretionary effort because they feel valued by you as their manager, their employer, and that's going to help in ownership and the success of an organization. These are awesome outcomes. So if you're interested in taking your inclusive leadership out of your organization, and I know so many of you, I know your community is so community committed, which is fabulous. Think about your boards. Think about your own board for your business. What does it look like? Who is on it? Does it reflect diversity from that honeycomb perspective? How about the boards that you volunteer on? And if there are open positions, how might you think differently? How do you volunteer? As an organization, where do you go in the community? Are there some diverse groups? Is it the Multicultural Center? Is it the Lutheran Social Services New American program? Where might you show up differently that says you're committed to diversity? Who are you listening to? Where are you speaking? Is there an opportunity to go on one of your college campuses and listen to someone who has a completely different background and experience and might have different views than you do, that you could develop your awareness if you're in that part of the community? I've talked about mentoring. That's critical. How about in our schools? Who are you making friendships with if you're a parent, a caregiver, an aunt like me who attends activity? How about our houses of worship or arts and culture organizations? Are we reflecting the diversity in our community and making others feel welcome? This happens in our neighborhoods too. So I'm going to take a few questions here in just a brief second. So if you haven't popped a question in the chat or you have a musing, I would love to hear from you. But here's what you can do to start right now. If you feel inspired, get the book. Again, this is really approachable. It is not filled with academic scholarship. And that's why I like it, because I feel like everybody can approach this. So read it. Use the book in a book club, whether it's with your networking group, your executive team, your YPN group, your professionals of color group. Read it together. If you want to learn about yourself, where you might be on the continuum, this website, it's free. And you can go ahead and complete an assessment that will give you feedback where you are as a leader. And it might help you know, okay, I'm aware. What are the next steps that I can take? And that would be going places, reading media, talking with people that are different than you are. And then finally, so many of you have indicated you have learning and development or leadership development programs. So here's an opportunity for you to say, let's add this curriculum into our learning. So we develop our leaders, not just as good leaders, but as inclusive leaders who can make that really big difference. So I hope we will see you at our next session. And Mason Rademacher, who is with the Chamber and has been my wonderful partner, is going to come off and pop up a few questions that maybe you have an interest in, that in the last 10 minutes, I might be able to talk a little to.
Thank you, Kira, for that warm introduction, and thank you all, and good morning for joining us. We are excited to get some of your questions answered this morning. As a reminder, please feel free to continue to send them into the chat, or I've included my email address in there, and if we cannot get to all of them, I promise that we will follow up in some way to get you the answers that you're looking for. The first question here, Kira, is there a resource or roadmap that can help an organization quickly identify policies and practices that are not inclusive?
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of an audit and having some awareness about where you would start, I would encourage you to look directly at your recruitment. That is a critical place to start, as well as any mentoring programs and your promotion. If you think about recruitment, mentoring, promotion, those often are the practices that need to be disrupted first in order to create a different pathway for individuals to be developed, be put in positions of decision making, what we might also call power. And a lot of individuals right now are leaning in because they see their management teams, their boards, their executive teams looking so much the same that it's critical. But I would also invite you to the 5th webinar because that is really where I'm going to outline what those practices are. So if you can make sure that's on your calendar, that's going to give you the details.
Awesome. You talked about some practices in there and different employee opportunities. What are maybe some key policies that our employers can start to look at too that might need some revision?
Well, my hope is that you have some policies around your recruitment strategy, and that you have some policies around search committees, how we select candidates, how we interview candidates. And that is really where the intention around creating equity and inclusion for diverse talent sourcing starts. So if you don't have those practices, maybe you're a smaller business compared to a larger business, then that would be the place to start. Because really, when you think about creating opportunity for other people who don't look like you or have your worldview, that has everything to how they enter the workplace. And right now, there are a lot of diverse people who maybe have access to these jobs, but don't have access to a career path or to these jobs. So defining what is your recruitment strategy? And this isn't about tokenism. That's really, really critical. But it might be, we are going to make sure that we go and advertise to 3 different diverse communities, whether it's Fargo Pride, whether it's the Professional of Colors Network, whether it's your veterans organization, your Muslim Community Center, that you're going to be intentional about sharing a job description or a job post. Maybe with your search committee, you're going to make sure not just one person is on that committee, you're going to have 2 or 3 people, because that's going to help with the bias that you might be telling a story about someone else, but the colleague with you wouldn't. And you've got to have training, specific training to help individuals realize, I can't ask these 6 questions of a candidate and then another different 6 questions for the candidate. There's really consistency here. So again, that 5th session, and I'm so excited that you're talking policy and practice, because that's really critical. Pay equity is another place to start. If I am a male in this role and you hire that person, when you hire a female in the role, do they have the same wage band? Or if I'm a female of color, I identify as a woman of color, where is my pay start? So really having a good concrete policies written on paper in your virtual binders, if you will, that talks about that work. So there's so much to talk about. in that space, but come on the 5th session. That'll be helpful. Unconscious bias next time will be really helpful to think about for recruitment and interviewing and promotion too.
Awesome. Thank you, Kira. Shifting topics just a little bit. When you referenced vulnerability towards the beginning, how do you suggest making the distinction of sharing too much personal information in the professional workspace with opening up enough to inspire others to be their authentic selves?
I appreciate that question, because sometimes, I've heard colleagues say, oh, I just didn't want to hear that from that person, right? It gets uncomfortable. But when we humanize ourselves and really show up that way, that's where someone else is going to feel safe. So, do I start the first time I meet someone with my long story? No. And do I create space to say, I would love to hear everything about you from day one? That's probably not the space that I'm going to create. But if you're trying to model, what essentially is that I'm inviting you to consider is modeling that authenticity that tells a bigger picture than who you are beyond your role. It might be, I am married with 2 kids and 2 dogs, and I grew up in, Minneapolis. It could be as simple as that. And it might be, I'm an atheist, and I am a lesbian, and I don't identify as a woman. I mean, it could be a number of different things. So I think it's important here that it's not necessarily so much about how much a person shares. It's just that you're creating a space for them that it's okay with what they share. And that's the critical thing. People telling stories that you say, oh, I wish I didn't hear that. That's a completely different story than allowing someone to say, I'm a first-generation American. My parents came from the Congo. That's a different story than the details. I don't know if that made enough sense or not, Mason.
No, thank you for touching on that. I think that it did address the heart of the question. And I have another one for you that just came in a few moments ago. How do you convince employees within an organization that training in the area of diversity and inclusion is important?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I will say to all of you executive leaders on this call and decision makers on this call today or this webinar that it is critical, and it is the new next step of engagement strategy, DE&I. And that if we don't train our colleagues about diversity, if we don't offer up opportunities to understand about difference or unconscious bias or cultural competencies, we will not be able to be successful in this place. When an employer starts just with recruitment for diversity, but doesn't work on creating the environment for inclusion and the policies for equity, that employee is going to say, I don't think I can talk about my partner. I don't think I can share my faith, or I can't bring out that hidden disability. I don't feel safe here. I'm going to go someplace else. So this is training that will build a better team, that will develop your people. And frankly, when you think about your external self as an organization and who you serve, it will help you be better equipped to serve the people. Because my hunch is you've got clients who are diverse, you've got customers, partners who reflect something on the diversity spectrum. So not only is it an engagement strategy, but it's also a strategy for your business. So it's critical. This work, I can't say it enough. And there is so much hope because so many of you are attending today. So thank you for that question. And it's incredibly important.
One final question here, Kira, for you before we wrap up this morning, and I turn it over to you to wrap it up. But how do you suggest influencing a culture of acceptance in the workplace, especially if you are not the lead or the director within that company, thinking more from an employee standpoint? How can you influence and help create that culture of acceptance?
Oh, I love the grassroots effort. That type of work just gives me goosebumps, and that's what I've really been involved in. And a lot of that is having conversations. finding out who your allies are in your organization, grabbing a coffee, going for a walk in this beautiful fall weather, talking about your ideas, reading, having the book club together. That's a great way to start building a coalition or a collective that as a group, maybe you can invite a conversation with your particular manager or your division leader, the project coordinator, the site manager, your VP, and then ultimately start using, if you're a beginning employee, start networking with people who might have that position privilege or proximity privilege, if you will, to that decision maker, and get them on your team and have them start opening doors for your small collective to have this conversation. That's how you build a coalition, a network. Start at the grassroots and find door openers for you that you can leverage their position power to get to that decision maker. And I want you to hear, whoever asked this question, wherever you are in your career journey, you can make a difference. Everybody on this call can make a difference. So no matter what your job role, your years of experience, don't be afraid to have these conversations, because we need you to do just that. So I think that was the last question that came from Mason. So thanks very much. The big takeaway, I think, is you're very interested in policies and practices. Again, you're going to hear from me more of that, but really specifically in the 5th session. So make sure that's on. So I'm grateful for you showing up today, and hopefully you feel inspired and have some takeaways that you can start considering. I'm looking at my notes here to make sure I close correctly. The Sherman HRCI continuing education credit codes will come out tomorrow. You will also receive a survey so you can give some feedback to the chamber and to me. So we welcome your feedback. And if you've registered for this series, which you have because you're here, you're completely registered for the whole rest of the series. And then finally, the chamber is doing the good work of recording this and making this available. So lower on the webpage where you're streaming from, you'll see last week's link, and then the link to this session will also be there. And I know the chamber and I want you to share this widely. So thank you again, and I'll look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks.